Mama.
Who are they?
They're with guns.
The perimeter alarm screamed through the citadel like a dying animal. Inside the fortress-like office complex, Matthew Vasari didn't flinch. He'd heard that sound before: rival gangs, federal raids, desperate assassins. But what came next, he had never experienced in his 45 years of ruthless survival. The heavy mahogany doors burst open. His head of security, Tony, a mountain of a man who'd seen everything, stood frozen, his face pale with something Matthew had never seen before: helplessness. Then she appeared. A little girl, no older than 8, soaking wet from the December rain, her small frame trembling violently. Her cheap cotton clothes clung to her tiny body, and her face was streaked with grime, rainwater, and raw terror that cut through the sterile air of Matthew's domain like a knife. She broke free from Tony's hesitant grasp. Her desperate brown eyes swept the opulent room, the antique Turkish rug, the tinted glass windows overlooking the conquered cityscape, the armed men who had stopped breathing until they locked onto Matthew. She didn't see a criminal. She saw power. She saw hope. She ran. Past the frozen bodyguards. Across the expensive carpet. And she slammed into Matthew Vasari's side, her tiny hands clutching his custom-tailored suit like it was the only thing keeping her from drowning. Every lieutenant in the room held their breath. Matthew Vasari hated being touched. Connection was vulnerability. Sentiment was weakness. They waited for the swift, ruthless dismissal, the cold removal of this interruption to the boss's carefully controlled world. But then she spoke, and the fortress shattered. "Please. They took my mama. They kidnapped Tracy." Her voice was a raw, heartbreaking sob that seemed to crack the very walls of the citadel. "They came, mister. 2 men with ski masks. They hit her. They covered her mouth and dragged her out. They said she has to pay for the key." The air in Matthew's office turned to ice. If you want to see what happens when the city's most feared mafia boss breaks every rule he's ever lived by, keep watching. Because what he does next will shake you to your core. But first, if you're loving the story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss these incredible tales. Now, let's continue. Matthew's internal world stopped. He looked down at Randy. He didn't know her name yet, but he would never forget it, and something ancient and buried shifted inside his chest. Her hopeful, desperate brown eyes and the tiny, vibrating body brought a cold wave of memory he'd spent 30 years trying to drown. He wasn't seeing a stranger. He was seeing himself. 3 decades ago, Matthew Vasari had been a helpless child watching his mother violently pulled from their home as leverage against his father. He remembered the exact feeling radiating from Randy now: cold abandonment, helpless terror, the world ending in slow motion. That moment had started his path to ruthless self-preservation. That moment had taught him his fundamental truth: connection is a vulnerability that rivals exploit. His childhood best friend, the only person he'd ever trusted, had been murdered because Matthew had dared to care. So he'd walled himself off, perfected the art of the non-feeling man, built the citadel not just around his office, but around his heart. Until now. Matthew did something no one in that room, not Tony, not Sal, his intelligence chief, not his most loyal lieutenants, had ever witnessed. He knelt. All 6'4" of the most feared boss in the tri-state area lowered himself to meet a terrified 8-year-old's gaze. Randy, seeing something other than ice flicker in those gray eyes, clung tighter. The words tumbled out in a rush of tears and hiccuping breaths. Her mother, Tracy, ran a small, struggling laundromat in the Lower West Side. They lived in a tiny apartment above it, just the 2 of them. Tonight, 2 men in ski masks had kicked down their door. They demanded money Tracy didn't have. When she refused, they'd cover her mouth to stop her screaming and drag her out into the rain. They left a note pinned to the door. For words that changed everything. Trade for the key. Randy had hidden in a laundry basket, terrified and sobbing. She'd heard them talking on crackling walkie-talkies, calling each other Ghost and Shadow. After they left, she'd run through the rain-slicked streets until she found the biggest, most powerful-looking building she could see. The Citadel. Matthew listened to every word, his gray eyes never leaving hers. This wasn't random street violence. This was a calculated message, a surgical strike for a specific target. Someone had sent professionals, not thugs. He gently pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, silk, expensive, monogrammed, and dabbed the grime and tears from her cheek with surprising tenderness. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. Randy," she whispered. "Randy, I will bring your mother home. I promise." The vow resonated with the weight of his empire. Matthew Vazzari never broke a promise. He stood, the stillness gone, replaced by lethal motion. When he spoke again, his voice was steel. "Tony, find a secure penthouse apartment. Top-tier security detail. Get a doctor and a nanny, immediately. No one sees her. No one knows she's here." Tony moved instantly, recognizing the cold fire in his boss's eyes. "Sal." His head of intelligence stepped forward. "I need every name tied to Ghost or Shadow. I need every rival using the word key in the last 6 months. I need a location, and I need it within the hour." His voice dropped to a lethal whisper. "Tracy is not to be harmed. If she is, the consequences will be biblical." Matthew Vazzari ignored the financial reports on his desk. He ignored the pending meetings with international contacts. He ignored the territorial disputes that required his attention. His entire network, the most efficient criminal intelligence apparatus in the tri-state area, was now focused on one thing: finding Tracy and understanding the key. As his team mobilized, Matthew went to work on the note himself. He examined it under light, noting the paper quality, the handwriting the way it had been pinned to the door. Professional work. This wasn't amateur hour. Trade for the key. The key to what? He dispatched his cleanup crew to the laundromat immediately. They had one job: find out everything about Tracy's life, her connections, her past. And find that key. 2 hours later, they called. They'd found it beneath a loose floorboard in Tracy's bedroom, exactly where Randy had mentioned her mother always checked before bed. A small, ornate, antique silver key. Clearly very old, perhaps 100 years, and bearing an intricate crest of a noble Italian house. When Matthew saw the photograph his team sent, a cold dart of recognition shot through him. The Vittor family crest. His mind raced backward through a decade of warfare. The Vittor family had been a rival syndicate he'd systematically dismantled and effectively erased from the city's map 10 years ago. Their operations, their territories, their legacy, all absorbed into Matthew's empire. Their last desperate leader, Vittor Jr., had been locked away in maximum security prison, sentenced to 15 years for racketeering and attempted murder. At the same time, Sal delivered his intelligence report, breathless from running across the building. "Boss, I've got it. Ghost and Shadow. They were Vittor's most brutal former operatives. Enforcers. They disappeared after the family fell, presumed dead or in hiding." He paused, his face grim. "They were both released from separate prisons 2 months ago. And boss, Vittor Jr. was paroled 3 weeks ago." The connection crystallized instantly in Matthew's mind, sharp and terrifying. The key wasn't about Tracy. Tracy was just an unfortunate, innocent woman who'd somehow stumbled upon something that belonged to the Vittor legacy. Maybe someone seeking refuge had given it to her. Maybe she'd found it. It didn't matter. What mattered was this: Vittor Jr. wanted to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his, a hidden family asset, secured before the empire fell. And he was using an innocent woman as leverage. This wasn't just about money. It was about revenge. It was about a man trying to resurrect a dead legacy by destroying Matthew's victory. Matthew understood something else, too. Vittor wouldn't stop. Men like him never did. If he got the key and Tracy lived, she'd be a witness. If Randy existed, she was a loose end. They were planning to kill them both. Matthew stood in his war room, surrounded by maps, surveillance photos, and intelligence reports. His team worked frantically around him, but he was calm. Dangerously calm. "What does the key unlock?" he asked Sal. We're still digging, boss, but based on the age and the crest, it's likely a safety deposit box. Old world. The kind that's been sitting untouched in some bank vault for decades. What's in the box? Unknown. But Vitor Sr. was paranoid. Before his empire fell, he moved significant assets into untraceable accounts. Cash, bonds, probably documents that could prove. Sal hesitated. That could prove what? That some of the assets you seized weren't entirely legally acquired by the family in the first place. Documents that, in the wrong hands, could be twisted to make you look like the thief. Matthew's jaw tightened. Vitor wasn't just after money. He was after vindication. Leverage. The ability to ruin Matthew's reputation while rebuilding his own. Where would he take her? Matthew asked. Somewhere he feels safe. Somewhere with history.
Sal pulled up a map.
The Vitor family owned several properties before the fall. Most were seized or sold. But there's one, an abandoned clock tower on the West End. The family used it for private business. Vitor Sr. died there, actually. That's where he'll be, Matthew said with certainty. He wants poetic justice. He checked his watch. It was approaching 10 p.m. They'd had Tracy for nearly 4 hours. Matthew made his decision. Leak a message through our channels. Untraceable. One line. Matthew Vasari has the key. If Tracy is harmed, the key is destroyed, and the Vitor legacy dies with it. Sal's eyes widened. Boss, if he knows you have it, he'll contact me directly. He'll set a meeting. He's desperate, Sal. Desperate men make mistakes. It took less than 30 minutes. Vitor Jr.'s voice came through on Matthew's secure line, shaking with fury and barely controlled desperation. You think you've won, Vasari? You think you can destroy my family and walk away? I think you made a mistake involving an innocent woman and her child, Matthew replied, his voice ice.
Midnight.
West End Clock Tower. You bring the key, I bring the woman. We trade. You try anything, and she dies screaming. The line went dead. Matthew stood, moving toward his private armory. He stripped off his suit jacket and began putting on darker, operational clothes. Tony and Sal watched him, understanding what this meant. Sir, let us handle this, Tony said carefully. You don't need to go personally. Yes, I do. Before leaving, Matthew made one stop. He walked to Randy's secure penthouse suite. She was asleep on a large bed, clutching a teddy bear a nurse had brought her. Her face, cleaned of grime, looked peaceful for the first time. On the bedside table was a crayon drawing she'd made before falling asleep. It showed a happy picture of Tracy holding a bouquet of bright flowers, smiling. 2 stick figures, Randy and her mama, holding hands under a sun. Matthew picked up the drawing carefully, folded it, and placed it inside his jacket pocket, precisely over his heart. This wasn't just business anymore. This was personal. The West End clock tower loomed against the black December sky like a tombstone. Its hands had stopped decades ago, frozen at midnight, a fitting symbol for the Vitor family's dead legacy. Matthew arrived in a single, unmarked sedan. He stepped out alone, his breath visible in the freezing air. The rain had stopped, but the ground was slick and treacherous. He knew Tony and Sal were positioned on nearby rooftops, invisible but watching through sniper scopes. This was the game. Appear vulnerable while maintaining absolute control. Vitor Jr. stood waiting in the tower's shadow, looking older and colder than Matthew remembered. 10 years in prison had carved lines into his face and hardness into his eyes. Flanking him were Ghost and Shadow, 2 slabs of muscle with dead eyes and scarred hands. Between them, bound and gagged, was Tracy. She was shivering violently, her face bruised, her eyes wide with terror. But when she saw Matthew, something flickered. Hope, maybe, or a recognition of the man her daughter had chosen to trust. The key, Vasari, Vitor rasped, his voice rough with years of rage. First the key, then the woman. Matthew looked at Tracy, then back at Vitor. You demand the key that unlocks your family's ruin. I demand the immediate, unharmed release of an innocent woman. Vitor laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Innocent? She hid what's mine. She's part of this now. He pulled a knife and held it to Tracy's throat. The key, or she bleeds out right here, and you can explain to that little brat why her mama's not coming home. The mention of Randy sent ice through Matthew's veins. He looked Vitor directly in the eye and spoke with deadly calm. You don't understand the law of this city, Vitor. You involved an innocent child. You crossed a line that doesn't get uncrossed. Spare me your morality, Vasari. You're a killer just like me. No, Matthew said quietly. I'm nothing like you. He reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a key. In the moonlight, it glinted silver, ornate, antique, bearing the Vitor crest. Here is your key, Matthew said. He held it up for Vitor to see, then tossed it at his feet. Vitor's eyes locked onto it immediately, greed and vindication flooding his face. Ghost bent down to retrieve it. That's when Matthew gave the signal. A barely perceptible nod. Everything happened at once. Tony and Sal struck from their positions. 2 tranquilizer darts, silent, precise, hit Ghost and Shadow before they could even process the movement. They dropped like stones. Vitor, realizing the deception, lunged at Matthew with a desperate, animalistic cry, the knife flashing toward Matthew's chest. Matthew moved like water. He blocked the knife arm, twisted, and used Vitor's momentum against him. The knife clattered to the ground. Matthew grabbed Vitor's arm and wrenched it backward until something cracked, bone giving way. Vitor screamed. Matthew didn't kill him. He slammed him against the concrete pillar of the clock tower and leaned in close, his voice a whisper of absolute menace. You wanted to know the difference between us? I don't use children as pawns. I don't hurt the innocent to rebuild my ego. Your family died because it was rotten from the inside. And you? Matthew released him, letting him crumple to the ground. You just proved you're no different than the disease that killed it. He turned away from Vitor's broken form and moved directly to Tracy. With gentle hands, the same hands that had just broken a man's arm, he cut her bonds and carefully pulled the gag from her mouth. It's over, he said softly. You're safe now. Tracy's legs buckled. Matthew caught her, supporting her weight. Tears streamed down her face, but she was silent in shock. Behind them, Tony and Sal secured the scene, zip-tying the unconscious Ghost and Shadow. They'd wake up in a secure location, facing questions from Matthew's people about who else knew about the key and Tracy's location. Vitor would face something worse, the silent, overwhelming consequence of attacking what Matthew Vasari had chosen to protect. As they walked toward the sedan, Tracy finally spoke, her voice hoarse. The key, he took it. Matthew reached into his other pocket and pulled out the real antique silver key, ornate, heavy, bearing the Vitor crest. No, Matthew said. He took a copy. A fake I had made this afternoon. Tracy stared at him, not understanding. I would never trade your life for a piece of metal, Matthew said. Never. Matthew took Tracy straight to the Citadel, to the secure penthouse where Randy waited. The guard stepped back, creating a silent corridor of respect as Matthew helped Tracy through the door. Randy was awake, sitting on the couch with the nurse, her eyes red from crying. The moment she saw her mother, time stopped. Mama, baby. The reunion was immediate and devastating. Randy launched herself across the room and threw herself into Tracy's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Tracy caught her, dropping to her knees, holding her daughter so tightly it looked like she'd never let go. They rocked together, crying, whispering words of love and relief that no one else in the room could quite hear. Matthew watched from the doorway, the crayon drawing still heavy in his pocket. Tony and Sal stood behind him, witnessing something they'd never thought they'd see, their boss caring about something more than territory and power. After several minutes, Tracy looked up at Matthew. Her face was streaked with tears, bruised and exhausted, but her eyes held something profound, gratitude mixed with awe. Why, she whispered, her voice breaking. Why did you risk everything for us? You don't even know us. Matthew was silent for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out Randy's drawing, The picture of Tracy holding flowers, the two of them happy under the sun. "Because your daughter showed me what courage looks like tonight," he said quietly. She ran into the den of the most dangerous man in the city, terrified, and begged him to be better than he was. And she was right to believe someone would help. He knelt down, bringing himself to Randy's level one more time. She looked at him with those hopeful brown eyes, still clutching her mother. "I made you a promise, Randy. I told you I'd bring your mama home. And I keep my promises." "Thank you," Randy whispered, then did something that shattered the last of Matthew's walls. She let go of her mother and hugged him, her small arms barely reaching around his broad shoulders. Matthew, the man who hated being touched, who had built an empire on isolation and self-preservation, hugged her back. When he finally stood, he addressed Tracy directly. "You're safe now. Both of you. You're under my protection." He paused, then continued. "The key your daughter mentioned, the real one, it opened a safety deposit box. Inside was a significant sum. Money that the Vitor family had earned legitimately before they turned to crime. Money that's been sitting untouched for decades." Tracy shook her head, not understanding. "But that's theirs." "It was stolen property being used as leverage by a dead empire," Matthew interrupted gently. "And now it's going to be used for something better." He pulled out a legal document his attorney had prepared that afternoon. "I've established a trust fund in Randy's name. The entire amount. It will cover her education, elementary school, high school, college, graduate school, if she wants it. Medical expenses. Whatever she needs to build the life she deserves." Tracy's hand flew to her mouth. I can't. That's too much." "It's not nearly enough," Matthew said. "But it's a start." 6 months passed like the turning of seasons. The Lower West Side had changed. The Red Serpents gang that had terrorized the neighborhood vanished overnight. The remnants of the Vitor family scattered to other cities, their power broken permanently. The streets were safer, quieter, patrolled by men who answered to Matthew Vasari, but who had been given different orders now. Protect the vulnerable. Tracy still ran her laundromat, but everything else was different. Matthew had bought the entire building, quietly and through legal channels. He'd renovated it top to bottom, new equipment, security systems, fresh paint. The top floor became a beautiful, spacious apartment for Tracy and Randy, with huge windows that let in light and a door that locked with 3 separate deadbolts. But the most significant change wasn't in the building or the neighborhood. It was in Matthew Vasari himself. Every Thursday evening, a black sedan would pull up outside the laundromat. Matthew would emerge alone, without his security detail. He'd nod to Tony, who waited in the car, and then he'd climb the stairs to the apartment. Tracy would let him in, offering him terrible coffee that he drank without complaint. They'd sit at the small kitchen table, and they'd talk about business sometimes, but mostly about normal things. Randy's grades, the weather, the new customers at the laundromat. And Randy would show him her drawings. She drew constantly now, bright, happy pictures of families and flowers and sunshine. She'd explain each one in detail while Matthew listened with the same intense focus he'd once reserved for intelligence reports and territorial disputes. One Thursday in June, Randy presented him with a new drawing. It showed 3 stick figures, a woman, a little girl, and a tall man in a suit. They were standing in front of a building, holding hands, all of them smiling. "That's you," Randy said, pointing to the tall figure. "That's us. That's our family." Matthew looked at the drawing for a long moment. Something in his chest, something that had been frozen for 30 years, cracked open completely. "Can I keep this one?" he asked softly. Randy nodded enthusiastically. "I made it for you. To say thank you for being our friend."
Friend.
Not the boss. Not Mr. Vasari.
Friend.
Matthew folded the drawing carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket, right over his heart, next to the first drawing she'd ever made. That night, as he drove back to the Citadel, Tony broke the silence. "You've changed, boss. The men have noticed." Matthew looked out at the city lights, the empire he'd built through ruthless calculation and controlled violence. "Have I?" "You smile now." Sometimes. You're still terrifying when you need to be, but... Tony paused, choosing his words carefully. You're more human.
Matthew thought about that.
About the fortress he'd built around himself after losing his mother, after watching his best friend die because he'd dared to care. About the decades of isolation and self-preservation. About a little girl who'd run into his office, soaking wet and terrified, and had seen something in him that he'd forgotten existed. I spent 30 years believing connection was a vulnerability, Matthew said quietly. That caring about someone gave your enemies a weapon to use against you. And now... Matthew thought about Randy's drawing, about Tracy's terrible coffee, about the way his chest felt lighter on Thursday evenings. Now I know I was wrong, he said. The fortress I built didn't make me stronger. It made me empty. Randy didn't save her mother by finding the most dangerous man in the city. He paused, the truth settling over him like a benediction. She saved me by showing me that the connection I feared was the only source of real strength. Tony nodded slowly. The men would follow you into hell, boss. They always have.
But now?
Now they'd follow you because they believe in what you're protecting. Matthew didn't respond, but he understood. His empire hadn't crumbled when he'd chosen to protect two innocent people. It had transformed. He was still feared, still powerful, still the undisputed boss of the tri-state area. But now, when people whispered his name in the streets, they didn't just speak of his ruthlessness. They spoke of the night Matthew Vazzari had risked everything for a little girl and her mother. They spoke of justice, of protection, of a criminal who had remembered how to be human. The citadel still stood, imposing and unbreakable. But inside, where Matthew Vazzari sat alone in his office, looking at a child's crayon drawing pinned to his wall, the fortress had cracked. And through that crack, finally, the light was getting in. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories that will restore your faith in humanity. And tell me in the comments, would you have the courage to run to a stranger for help like Randy did? Drop your thoughts below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.